Well, we had a little introduction last Sunday to the book of Exodus. We kind of went through the time period, the author, and some of the main themes are in it. So I'll just briefly review a couple of things. One, we said that Moses has traditionally been known as the author of Exodus. In fact, the first 5 books, called the Pentateuch, is credited to Moses. And of course, Genesis, he would have written from records, from oral tradition, and records that were kept and written down. In fact, they probably, when Jacob and his family went into Egypt at the end of Genesis, they probably had all the records of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and all the family thing with them. So that would have been easy to take that information. And of course, Exodus through Deuteronomy, Moses would have written from biographical and autobiographical, because that was his life and his leadership. He would have written from that. So the time period. Oh, we also mentioned, I think in Mark's gospel, 2 different places, Jesus called Exodus the book of Moses. And I mentioned that's good enough for me. If Jesus says Moses wrote it, then I believe it for sure. Time period, we're probably looking at sometime after the Exodus, but before the death of Moses, obviously. So the Exodus, the actual leaving of Egypt, was around 1447 BC. And Moses died around 1406 BC. So we're probably looking at 1420s, 1430s BC. So almost 3,500 years ago that was written. And as the book of Exodus begins, the Israelites, long after the death of Joseph, find themselves as slaves in Egypt. So let's do a little bit. Let's go back to the end of Genesis. And I want to pick up some things there. We look at the very last 5 verses in Genesis chapter 50, kind of set the context. You remember Joseph was the son of Jacob, who was sold into slavery by his brothers, rose to be prime minister in Egypt, saved his family from the famine, etc. And it says in verse 22 of chapter 50 of Genesis, so Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's house. Joseph lived 110 years. And Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the 3rd generation, the children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were counted as Joseph's own. So Ephraim and Manasseh were the 2 sons of Joseph. In verse 24, and Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old. They embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. So Joseph knew that God was going to visit them and bring them out of this land back to their promised land. That was the promised land. And Joseph knew that. And so let's go then to the first chapter of Exodus. And we'll make a revisit here shortly to Genesis. But let's look at the first 7 verses of Exodus. Kind of gives us a little preview of what I just talked about and what's to come. So Exodus 1:1 said, these are the names of the sons of Israel, who is Jacob, who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his own household. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so the land was filled with them. And I mentioned last week that 70 persons entered Egypt from Joseph's family at the time of the famine. So that'd be Jacob and his other sons. Joseph was already there. His other sons and their wives and their children, and they totaled about 70 people. And if we fast forward 400 and some years, to the time of the Exodus, there were probably 2.5 million people, they suspect, leaving Egypt. That's the Hebrews. And we see the mention of them in verse 7 there. They multiplied, and it grew exceedingly strong. They were fruitful and increased greatly in population. And you see that's quite a number of people that were at the end of this story when it comes to the time of the Exodus. There were a lot of them there. So what I want to do, just briefly go back to Genesis 49. So we're going to go back 2 chapters, Genesis 49. And this is Jacob, the father of all these men, these 12 tribes. And he's getting ready to die. And he calls his sons in, and he's now in Egypt, and he's going to bless them. He gives a blessing to each of them. I just wanted to pick out a few just to kind of talk about it just briefly, because this kind of sets the table for what we're going to see when we go into Exodus. Look at the first 4 verses. He's talking to his firstborn son. So they're all his sons are sitting around, and he calls them one by one, and they're either going to get a blessing or they're going to get scolded. And so this is what he says to Reuben. It says, Genesis 49, verse 1, Jacob called his sons and said, "Gather yourselves together, that I might tell you what shall happen to you in days to come. Assemble and listen, O sons of Jacob. Listen to Israel, your father. Reuben, you're my firstborn, my might, the first fruits of my strength, preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power, unstable as water. You shall not have preeminence, because you went up to your father's bed. You defiled it. He went up to my couch." So what's that all about? Well, if we go back to Genesis 32, we see that Reuben visited his father's concubine and had a relationship. And we think, oh, why is that in the scripture? Why did Jacob have a concubine? This may answer some questions for later on when we see, like when we did 1 Kings and we studied about Solomon, and we end up finding at his downfall he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. Well, that's not what God ordained. Marriage is between one man and one woman, and that was the biblical standard and still is. So we see these people having concubines and visiting prostitutes and all that, and that is immorality. But the Bible doesn't sugarcoat things. So when you see that, don't say, well, look what we go back and see the first man who did this was Lamech. It was in the line of Cain. Remember, Cain killed his brother Abel. And we see Lamech was the first one who had 2 wives. And man, he was a bad dude. He talks about murdering someone. And he said, if Cain had 7, it would be 77 times for me. He's like, he prided himself in being sinful. Let's look at the next few verses 5 to 7. Again, this is another sinful episode that Jacob is bringing up. Verse 5, chapter 49. Simeon and Levi are brothers. Weapons of violence are their swords. Let my soul come not into their counsel. O my glory, be not joined to their company. For in their anger they killed men, and in their willfulness they hamstrung oxen. Cursed be their anger, for it's fierce, and their wrath, it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. This is a story that it was in Genesis 34. There was a man named Shechem, the son of Hamor, who was a Hivite, and Shechem took their sister, Jacob's daughter, Dinah, and had a illegal relationship with her, and she defiled Dinah. And the 2 brothers found out about it, and they made a false agreement. They went to, because Hamor was representing his son who had committed this crime, and they come before Jacob and his sons, and they said, he really likes your daughter, and he'd like to have her in marriage. And Simeon and Levi said, well, if we can't do that because you're uncircumcised. And so they agreed to have them all circumcised, and while they were healing, Simeon and Levi went into the town and slaughtered them, killed all the men. And that's what he's talking about here. They're wicked. They did sinful things. And Jacob said, you made us a stench. To all the neighboring communities around, all these nations are going to know that we are wicked. All right, now we start seeing a little brighter picture here. Verse 8 to 12 is about Judah. Verse 8. Judah, your brother, shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's son shall bow down before you. Judah is a lion's cub. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He stooped down. He crouched as a lion, as a lioness. Who dares rouse him? And here's verse 10. We start seeing a little picture of the line of Judah, which is through David and then onward to Christ. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. Binding his foal to the vine, his donkey's colt to the choice vine. That should bring something there in the back of your mind. He washed his garments in wine and vestures in the blood of grapes. His eyes are darker than wine, his teeth whiter than milk. So we see some prophecies there that are fulfilled later with Christ. Even Zechariah talked about riding on a donkey and such. And so we see firstly David and then onward to Christ. And then let's look then lastly at Joseph. That's down in verse 22 to 26. He's going to bless Joseph. Okay, Genesis 49, verse 22. Joseph is a fruitful bough by a spring. His branches run over the wall. The archers bitterly attacked him, shot at him, harassed him severely, yet his bow remained unmoved. His arms were made agile by the hands of the mighty one of Jacob. From there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. By the God of your father who will help you, by the Almighty who will bless you with blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep that crouches beneath, blessings of the breast and of the womb. The blessings of your father are mighty beyond the blessings of my parents, up to the bounties of the everlasting hills. May they be on the head of Joseph and on the brow of him who was set apart from his brothers. So this old man is getting ready to die, and he's getting these blessings and he's giving these scoldings, but he blesses Joseph immensely here, does he not? What a great thing to say about your son. And you say, why would he do that? Well, think about this. Joseph represented God's faithfulness through great adversity. Remember, Joseph was sold into slavery, and he was in the dungeon. He was in the prison. He was accused of something he didn't do, and he was thrown in prison. He was forgotten about for years until it was told he had this ability to interpret dreams, which he gave to God. And so his actions by God leadings ultimately saved his family. And so now Jacob's looking back on that. All those years he didn't have his son, like 17 years. He thought he was dead. He thought he was gone. He's reunited with him, and he's recalling all that Joseph did and how God had held him up and lifted him up and made him prosper. So that's pretty neat to read that. And then we come to Genesis 49, the last portion, 28 to 33, is about the death of Jacob. The death of Jacob. His grandfather Abraham had purchased property as a burial plot. It's the cave at the field of Machpelah, east of Mamre, in the land of Canaan. And that's repeated over and over again because Abraham was buried there, and Sarah was buried there, and Isaac was buried there, and Rebekah was buried there. And so all these family members. And so when this comes, they take Jacob, and he takes a great entourage of the Egyptians to go with him, and they go to the exact spot. And this is where they buried Jacob. And they had a great mourning for Jacob from his people. Accompanied his body from Egypt, and they took him up and buried him in the family burial plot. Okay, so that kind of covers the first 7 verses. There's a lot there if you go back and look at the prophecies and the blessings from Jacob to his sons. So let's go on in Exodus 1 and begin here in verse 8. Exodus 1, verses 8 to 14. Remember, Joseph has died. The family has increased as the generations have gone by. It says, now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. Some things never change. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves, and they made their lives bitter with hard service. In mortar and brick, and all kinds of work in the field, and all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. So, a change of administrations brings a change of attitude and friendships. The new king, which would be the Pharaoh, didn't know Joseph or his family. And I believe this probably took place, I mentioned last week, probably took place gradually. It wasn't a sudden change. It would have been gradually as the years went by. You think about our recollection of events happened 10 years ago. And then those old enough to know 20 years ago. Or think about things that happened 50 years ago, how your memories kind of fade and you don't remember all the names and faces. Same thing would have happened here. They tend to fade as people die, cultures change as we age. We forget things in the past. And so this brought about the progressive antagonism and animosity against the Hebrews. So as time went by, instead of being honored as the family of Joseph, who would save people back in those days, they were looked at as liabilities. Liabilities. A threat in a potential time of war. Too many of those Israelites are going to have an army against us. We got to get rid of them. We got to keep them under our thumb. You see verse 9. The people of Israel are too many, too mighty for us. Come, let's deal shrewdly with them, or else they may rise up and join our enemies, and we'll also lose our free labor force. We can't have that. And so the government got involved, placed heavy burdens on them. Basically, they worked from sunup to sundown, no coffee breaks, no days off. Moses even mentioned they built 2 cities for the Pharaoh. And the text says the more they oppressed the Hebrews, the more their population grew. The more they were oppressed, the more their population grew. You think maybe that God was watching over his people? I think so. Verse 12 stresses the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel, so they made their lives very difficult. Very difficult. And that involved things that really aren't written in Scripture, but we can kind of read between the lines, that involved probably some beating, some imprisonment for not working, for not meeting a certain quota every day and things they had to do, and they were treating them really poorly. The verses 13 and 14, Moses uses the same word twice. It translated the word ruthlessly. Moses tells the Egyptians ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves. Ruthlessly, which means without mercy. And so that's the condition they find themselves in as we come to verse 15 then, the last section here. The people are working hard. They had taskmasters over them watching probably groups of 25 or 30 and doing their construction work. And they had whips and they had ways to punish them if they weren't keeping up. And as someone gets older, they can't keep up. Like somebody 60 can't keep up with what somebody's 20 is doing. They probably just took the whip to them. Things like that, very ruthlessly, if you want to think about some of the things they might have done. So let's look at verses 15 to 22 then. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah. Okay, these are Hebrew midwives. When you serve as a midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it's a son, you shall kill him. But if it's a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this and let the male children live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that's born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. Okay, so that's the command. The command to commit genocide against any male baby born to the Hebrews. That's evil. That's just purely evil and satanic. You're going to kill a whole race of people there. 2 Hebrew midwives are mentioned by name, Shiphrah and Puah. So Moses had those 2 women, and they, as he grew up, he might have known them. Right? He grew up in Pharaoh's house, and they were still alive at the time of his birth. Perhaps he knew them personally. And here we could say this is even brought out in the New Testament. They feared God more than they feared man. They did not fear Pharaoh. And God protected him. He blessed him, didn't he? Psalm 118 verse 6 says, the Lord's on my side. I will not fear. What can man do to me? What can man do to me compared to what God can do to me? So they refused to follow the edict of Pharaoh. And they told him just a little white lie, didn't they? Just a little white lie. So I wanted to, just rhetorically, is it okay to tell a little white lie on occasion? In this case, right? What were they doing? They were protecting their people. Is it okay to tell lies? I would say absolutely. If the lie defies an evil that goes against biblical standards or biblical principles. If it protects the innocent and vulnerable against an unjust decree. Think about those in Europe who protected Jews against the Nazi regime. There's a great movie made about Schindler's List, and used what he had, his wealth, to protect those who were helpless against an evil regime. And so there's biblical standards that, we can go a certain point and then we say, no, I'm going to follow what God says. And that's what these 2 women did. They didn't fear man, they feared God. And what does it say? It says, verse 21, and because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. He blessed them. They weren't about to kill their own people. God protects those who walk by faith and not by sight. That keeps coming up every week, doesn't it? We walk by faith and not by sight. So let's spend just a moment on verse 22. It says, Pharaoh declared that every son born to the Hebrews be cast in the Nile, but let every daughter live. Why would he do that? There's a couple of reasons I came up with, and maybe we'll talk about it afterwards. One would be that, boys grew up to be a fighting army against the Egyptians, and this must be prevented. So the boys grew up to be men. We've got to get rid of them because we don't need any more soldiers fighting against us. Well, what happens with girls? They grow up to be women the Egyptians could take for their wives. And they could intermarriage between the Hebrews, perhaps, and the Egyptians, and slow down the population growth of the Hebrews. And then through intermarriage, they could eventually turn, as we saw with Solomon, the women turned them away from worshiping the true God and began to worship all the false gods of the Egyptians. And slowly and surely, if that had kept going, the worship of God would have been diffused. And so those are a couple of reasons that Pharaoh would have made that edict, but God wasn't about to have that. And so we come to this point at the end of chapter 1, and this has kind of set the stage for a Savior to come on the scene, a man chosen by God to lead his people, to deliver them up out of slavery in Egypt. And Moses is the man that God raised up for this purpose. And in Moses, this gives us there's a thing called typology. We look at the Old Testament, and all these are types of Christ we see in the Old Testament. Moses would be one, a great leader who led his people out of slavery. Christ led us out of bondage to sin. Melchizedek, remember we talked about him in Hebrews, Melchizedek, his type of Christ by his priesthood. He was not a Levite. He was a different type of priest. And it says you're in the order of Melchizedek, the author of Hebrews said about Christ. And then Joseph. We just read about Joseph at the end of Genesis. Joseph was a type of Christ. He was convicted of something he didn't do, and he paid the price, but yet he saved his people. All these are types. You can hopefully the gears are rolling in your head there. You think about Jesus and all the things he did, and these people in the Old Testament. And of course, the Passover lamb that was slaughtered. And the blood of that lamb saved the people from the angel of death. And so there's just four right there, four types of Christ. And Moses certainly is one of those who, by his life and by his obedience to God and by his servanthood and getting on his face for his people to intercede for them, he's a type of Christ. Right? So that's where we stand here at the end of Exodus 1. And next week, Edward will pick up with chapter 2 as we look at the birth of Moses and that great story. So if we have any questions or comments.